In the quiet suburban landscape of Seattle's East Side in the mid-1990s, classrooms buzzed with the ordinary rhythm of homework, chalk dust, and children learning their way through adolescence. Among the teachers at Shorewood Elementary was Mary Kay Letourneau, a bright, charismatic educator who was well-liked by many of her colleagues. To most parents, she seemed nurturing, warm even. The sort of teacher who stayed back after school to help a struggling student, who remembered birthdays, who made learning feel safe. But behind that pleasant exterior was a hidden turbulence, a life fraying at the seams long before anyone realized how devastating the unraveling would become. Mary Kay was married, with several children, but her marriage was messy and strained. Financial stress, arguments, and emotional distance ran deep. To acquaintances, she appeared cheerful. To those closer, she seemed restless, searching for validation, clinging to anyone who admired her. She was a woman teetering on the edge of her own private cliff. And then there was one particular student, an enthusiastic, artistic 12-year-old boy who often stayed after class to draw and talk. A child who saw her not as a teacher but as a mentor, someone he trusted. And Mary Kay crossed a line that no teacher, no adult, has the right to cross. What started as after-school conversations turned into private moments. Moments became secrecy. And secrecy turned into something deeply wrong, something dangerous. Mary Kay's actions moved from inappropriate to criminal, all while the community remained oblivious. The relationship did not stay hidden for long. Rumors circulated. A fellow teacher became uneasy when she saw Mary Kay and the boy alone too often. Parents whispered. Eventually, someone reported their suspicions. The truth unraveled. When police questioned Mary Kay, she denied everything. Calmly, confidently, almost chillingly. But soon the evidence emerged and her deception collapsed. The reality was impossible to ignore. The arrest shocked the entire nation. A respected teacher, a mother, a wife, and yet, someone who had betrayed every boundary of trust. Courtrooms filled with reporters. Headlines exploded across every television screen. A teacher, a student, a crime that should never have happened. Mary Kay pled guilty and was ordered to 6 months in jail, along with strict instructions to stay away from the boy entirely. This was meant to be a line in the sand, a final warning. But even that boundary didn't stop her. Just weeks after her release, she violated the court order and met with the boy again. Authorities discovered them together, and the consequences became far more severe. Her probation was revoked. She was sentenced to over 7 years in prison. During this time, the case went from scandal to national obsession. Talk shows debated it. True crime analysts dissected it. Some tried to romanticize it, completely ignoring the fact that this was abuse. Others felt disturbed by the coldness with which Mary Kay spoke of her actions, as though she failed to grasp the harm she had caused. There was something unsettling about the calmness in her interviews, something eerie about the way she framed herself as misunderstood rather than responsible. For many, that was the scariest part. Her actions had changed a boy's life forever and shattered trust in a place meant to be safe, a school. And though the law had finally caught up with her, the story was far from over. Because even behind bars, Mary Kay's shadow loomed over the community. Parents watched teachers more closely. Schools tightened their policies. The world had been reminded of a chilling truth. Predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the people we trust the most. When Mary Kay Letourneau walked out of the prison gates after years of confinement, the cool Washington air felt different than she remembered. The world had changed. The people had changed. But the weight of her name carried the same heaviness it always had. Her case had never truly disappeared from the public consciousness. It lingered like a shadow, quiet, unsettling, unresolved. Reporters spoke her name with the same mix of disbelief and dread they had used years earlier. Parents still remembered the shock of discovering that a trusted teacher had crossed a line so severe it defied understanding. And now, as she stepped back into the outside world, her every move seemed to echo with the consequences of her past. The moment she returned home, the cameras followed. Neighbors peered through blinds. Journalists stationed themselves at the end of the street. Commentators prepared their talking points, ready to reanalyze the case from every possible angle. But despite all the external noise, the largest storm still lay within the life she was about to re-enter, a life that had been shaking long before the bars closed behind her. While Mary Kay served her sentence, the boy at the center of the case grew up beneath the glare of an unwanted spotlight. When she first encountered him, he had been a child, a student, someone learning multiplication tables and drawing cartoon characters in the margins of his notebook. But now he was older, a young man thrust into adulthood far earlier than nature intended. His world had been shaped by the aftermath of decisions he never had the emotional maturity to understand. He had been shielded from some truths, exposed to others far too soon, and became the focus of a national conversation about boundaries, trust, and abuse. Even as he tried to build some semblance of normalcy, people recognized him. Some felt pity. Others seemed confused, unsure how to react to someone whose childhood had been consumed by a scandal that should have never happened. Teachers whispered. Classmates asked questions they had no right to ask. And through all of it, he carried the burden of a story that was never truly his to begin with. By the time Mary Kay finished her sentence, he had become an adult in the eyes of the law, at least chronologically. But age doesn't erase the past. It doesn't erase the imbalance. And it certainly didn't erase the psychological complexities of his relationship with the woman who had crossed the line that changed both of their lives. That's why the world was stunned when he petitioned the court to lift the no-contact order. Most people assumed the separation would be permanent, a necessary boundary to protect him and allow him to rebuild. But in a twist that ignited another wave of public outrage, he insisted he wanted communication restored. The judge, acknowledging his legal adulthood, agreed. The reaction was immediate. Advocates for survivors of abuse expressed deep concern. Therapists explained the long-lasting effects of grooming. Commentators debated whether someone shaped by such an unequal relationship could truly make independent decisions about it. But the law had spoken, and Mary Kay, now free, stepped back toward the very person she had once been forbidden to contact. Their reunion confused many. To some, it felt like an uncomfortable continuation of a deeply disturbing dynamic. To others, it appeared to be the product of psychological entanglement that had started long before he could recognize it. And to a small number of misguided observers, it was framed as something romantic, a misinterpretation that only heightened the unease surrounding the case. Within a year of her release, they made headlines again when the pair married. It was a decision that unsettled nearly everyone watching. Cameras surrounded the venue. News outlets prepared special segments. And people across the country felt something deeply uncomfortable. Not because they were witnessing love, but because they were witnessing the long-term consequences of manipulation playing out in real time. He was hardly into adulthood. She was decades older, with years of authority and influence over him. Their first children together had been born when he was still far below the age of consent. These facts hovered in the air like a fog no one could ignore. The wedding didn't close the case. It amplified its strangeness, underscoring the lingering effects of a relationship that had never begun on equal ground. Life after marriage didn't bring peace. Their daily routines were marked by whispers and constant judgment. Wherever they went, eyes followed. People recognized them in grocery stores or parking lots. Some stared with discomfort, others with morbid curiosity. And while Mary Kay occasionally granted interviews to defend their life together, he rarely spoke, often appearing quiet, withdrawn, and uncertain. Meanwhile, their children grew up in an environment shaped by national scrutiny. They learned early on that their family was different, that strangers knew their parents' story, that their mother's past had turned their home into a symbol of something much darker than most children ever have to understand. They faced questions before they understood their meaning. They felt the pressure of a narrative they didn't choose. And they, too, carried the weight of decisions made long before their birth. As the years passed, the cracks in the relationship widened. The age difference that Mary Kay had downplayed became harder to ignore as he grew further into adulthood and began forming independent thoughts, experiences, and emotional needs, ones he had not been able to fully develop in the shadow of a relationship rooted in power imbalance. What had once appeared to him as loyalty or connection began to look different when viewed from the vantage point of maturity. There were disagreements, small at first, then louder, more frequent. He sought more independence. She felt threatened by distance. The dynamic that had once drawn them together now began to push them apart. And slowly, the bond that had survived prison, public condemnation, and national debate began to unravel. By the late 2010s, their separation became undeniable. They no longer appeared together in public. Friends noticed the growing distance. The silence between them had changed from comfortable to strained, from familiar to heavy. And eventually, they drifted into separate lives, each carrying their own interpretations of the past. For him, distancing himself wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't filled with accusations or explanations. It was quiet. A quiet attempt to reclaim something he had never fully possessed: control over his own story. He avoided interviews. He declined comment requests. He stepped back from the public eye. His silence became his shield, his way of saying what he couldn't articulate openly. Mary Kay, once the center of media storms, now lived a quieter existence. She worked occasional jobs. She kept a low profile. She saw her children. But the energy she once had, the defiant tone, the insistence that the world misunderstood her, slowly faded. Age, time, and reality wore down the edges of her once unwavering narrative. The world no longer chased her, it had moved on to other scandals. But in the quiet of her later years, she began facing the consequences that had always been waiting beneath the surface. Then in 2020 she received the diagnosis that would mark the final chapter of her life: cancer. It progressed rapidly. In some ways it felt symbolic, not as punishment but as a reminder that life moves forward whether we want it to or not. The body eventually demands its own truth. And the illusions people create, romantic illusions, defensive illusions, self-justifying illusions, cannot save them from the one reality every human must face. As her health declined, the public discussion around her story returned, but with a different tone. The shock had worn off. The outrage had quieted. What remained was reflection, a reconsideration of the lasting impact the case had on society, on education systems, on legal discussions about power and consent. It became less about spectacle and more about understanding the harm that arises when authority is abused. In her final months, she was cared for by people who knew her beyond the headlines, though the scars of the past were impossible to erase. She became frail, quieter, more reserved. The fiery, defensive personality that once faced down cameras had been replaced by a woman living in the shadow of a story that would always define her. And when she passed away in July of that year, the country paused, not with celebration, not with sorrow, but with contemplation. Her death did not close the story, it reopened the conversation. People began revisiting the details of the case. Many now saw it through the lens of better understanding grooming and psychological manipulation. Society had matured in its awareness of boundaries. Experts once again discussed the long-term impact of the relationship on the victim, now a man who remained private during the final chapter of her life. And that privacy said everything. He did not appear on camera. He did not issue dramatic statements. He did not revisit the past publicly. The distance he chose in those years reflected a truth many suspected but few said out loud. He needed space. Space from the story, from the scrutiny, and perhaps from the woman whose choices had shaped the entirety of his youth. In the years following her death, people still spoke of the case, but now with a sobering clarity. It was no longer framed as a shocking scandal or a twisted love story. It was seen for what it had always been, a cautionary tale about the damage caused by violating trust. It served as a reminder that children can be manipulated into believing they have agency when they do not, that power imbalances can distort emotions, and that the consequences of such relationships are lifelong. Schools strengthened boundaries between teachers and students. Parents became more vigilant. Counselors became more involved. The case had changed the system in ways that became subtly woven into policy and practice. But beyond the institutions and headlines, the story remained deeply human, a tale of lives disrupted, innocence lost, and the long haunting effects of decisions made by someone in a position of authority. If there is any lesson left behind, it is this: danger does not always come with warning signs. It does not always hide in dark alleys or behind sinister expressions. Sometimes it arrives dressed in trust, in mentorship, in authority. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it encourages. Sometimes it feels safe, until it isn't. And that is what makes the story of Mary Kay Letourneau so unsettling. Not its sensationalism. Not its notoriety. But its reality. Its reminder that even in familiar places, schools, classrooms, ordinary neighborhoods, boundaries must be protected. Because when they break, the damage spreads far beyond the moment of impact. It echoes through years, through relationships, through entire lives. Her story, in the end, is not one of romance or mystery or redemption. It is a warning. A warning that the cost of violating trust is immeasurable. A warning that children deserve unwavering protection. A warning that the scars of manipulation can hide beneath silence. And a warning that the people we trust the most can sometimes be the very ones who blur the boundaries meant to keep us safe. The story did not end in a dramatic confrontation or a cinematic moment of truth. It ended quietly, as real stories often do, with lives moving forward, carrying the weight of the past in ways the world will never fully see. And in that quiet, the most haunting truth remains. Sometimes the most terrifying stories are not the ones we invent, they are the ones that actually happened.